Finland has become the 31st member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or in short, NATO. What does that mean for the international state order? In this episode, we'll find out. My name is Emre Şentürk, and welcome back for another podcast episode of Esito Magazine. So, let's get started. One of the most important developments in the last couple of years from an international politics perspective is the enlargement of NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization and was founded in 1949. Now, with Finland joining NATO, it sparked much controversy because even in the run-up to this membership, there was much debate around, should Finland or also Sweden was also in the talks join NATO in order to, kind of further the enlargement of this security organization. And the reason for that is that historically NATO was basically a response to the forming of the Soviet bloc, meaning that it was kind of a Western counterweight in terms of security policy to the communist or socialist regime of the Soviet Union, meaning there is a very deeply enshrined ideological component to the founding of NATO. Over the years, NATO became bigger and obviously is centered around a mutual security pact of European countries, kind of in a sense that when one country is attacked, that all others are obliged to help and join forces on the side of the defending NATO nation. So it is also a very unique organization. Such security organizations are kind of recent if we look at the international state history. Obviously, there have been alliances around for quite some centuries, but in this form, that it forms kind of a block of many nations of different kind of cultural backgrounds, with different cultural backgrounds and histories, and also objectives in the international state order. This is kind of a unique development and a unique organization, and pretty successful in that as well. Opposed to that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, basically Russia stood alone against NATO. NATO didn't dissolve. The need was still there, basically in order to keep up this security construct. And in this whole development with involving Finland and Sweden in the enlargement discussion and process, the problem was always that Russia basically felt that the NATO is expanding east and more towards the Russian border, triggering security concerns there. In the case of some kind of tensions, Russia has basically a big disadvantage because all the NATO border is basically bordering with Russia, and they have better access and direct access to the Russian mainland. So there's no buffer zone or something like that. With Finland joining now the NATO, we have a direct land border. Obviously, it's very inaccessible due to natural conditions. But nonetheless, I mean, there is another border and another opportunity to kind of enter Russia. Obviously, Russia had big problems with that in the run-up to this whole situation, and it was never desired by Russia, and basically an unacceptable move from their perspective. Sweden didn't join so far, but nonetheless this move triggered some controversy. And there are two mainstream opinions on this move, and in this episode I'm going to explain to you why both of them are more or less wrong. So there are some assumptions that are not quite right. It is, and let's maybe start with the Russian side, because we talked about the historical development. that is kind of this ideological, where this ideological component plays an important role. And what we can see is that Russia continuously warned NATO and said, well, guys, look, we accept that you have the security organization, and that's perfectly fine. And you can do whatever you want, but please do not expand eastwards. And the NATO said, all right, we don't have any intention of expanding to the east, and so on and so forth. Basically, with including Ukraine to talks, membership talks, and also supplying Ukraine weapons and so on and so forth, the argumentation often is that the ongoing conflict in Ukraine was basically triggered by NATO troops and NATO weaponry positioned and placed in Ukraine, which Russia wanted to prevent or respond to. And instead of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, Russia wanted to invade Ukraine first, because in that case NATO is not going to pull a member into a security organization that is at war with one of the most powerful nations in the world. So that would trigger a large scale war. And before, in peacetime, Ukraine becomes part of NATO, Russia wanted to invade this country in order to prevent that, but also to kind of counteract the eastward movement and kind of create a neutral ground. So if you remember, when the conflict in Ukraine started, one of the main demands was the demilitarization of Ukraine in order to create kind of a buffer to the NATO bloc. So that is the argumentation that the eastward movement of NATO has triggered, actually, or provoked the Ukraine war. I totally think that this is a valid point, kind of pushing towards the border and expanding towards a country with an antagonistic view and stance towards the own alliance is a provocation. It often proved as a valid ground for war. Could have Russia reacted a bit more professional? Were there other ways potentially? But we do not have the whole pool of information within all those developments. For example, when I just talked about NATO placing weapon systems in Ukraine, there is little evidence, to kind of substantiate that. I mean, this is just an assumption and based on some kind of vague comments, but there's no clear evidence. But I assume that this is one of the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine. So the argumentation by Russia is, please do not expand eastwards. We feel kind of pushed into a corner. We have security concerns. And many other countries and actors in the international state order also kind of defended this view. Turkey, for example, actually as a NATO member, actually vetoed the membership of Finland and Sweden before. And these kind of decisions need to be taken unanimously. Turkey kind of blocked the membership at first, but now Turkey kind of approved it in the end, making it possible for Finland to join. So there is kind of this view saying that, well, NATO, everything fine, but you might go a little too far with expanding to the east. And yes, there is some truth to that, but we are actually in an international state order where power and power politics play an important role. This is not to say that this is right, but this is the realistic and current view. Maybe you've read my book DEVLET. I highly recommend it to you, because there's also a very, very extensive chapter on what drives states and state behavior. The current situation is that power, monetary or military power, are those motives behind state behavior. And because that is the case, Russia should have done or could have done a better job establishing their own security bloc. I mean, there is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that kind of is a counterweight to NATO. However, this is by far not as strong of a cooperation and organization in the sense that there is so much substance to it as NATO. For example, the budgets of NATO are far greater, membership count is far greater than that. The obligations in the NATO treaty are far more extensive than what the SCO, so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which China and Russia are part of, actually entail. So Russia could have done a better job of building their own bloc. They could have expanded towards the West if they had aspirations of securing the border. They could have built a stronger border and place their military more prominently at their own borders, kind of flexing the muscle and saying, guys, do not come here, right? Plenty of ways to do that. So afterwards, kind of crying about, NATO expanding east and saying, well, you promised that that you're not going to expand east, is kind of a weak move. Yeah, if we have to be honest, you can basically also say, well, this was the goodwill of the Russians, of course, understand, but there was also the Crimea movement, the Crimea move and annexation, where they tried to regain some territory there, but in the end, it was not that strong, strong of a response to what NATO did. So this argumentation of saying, well, NATO provoked Russia is obviously true. There is provocation, but in the end, the system is designed in a way that allows for that. And if the other player or the other actor in this game is 1 or 2 steps ahead, then this is your own fault, basically. And there are plenty of ways for Russia to expand, or was actually in the run-up or the last couple of years, to extend their security cooperation in other areas of the world, which would have deterred, obviously, NATO enlargement. Maybe it would have encouraged NATO enlargement, but in the end, then you would have a greater counterweight against this enlargement. So I think this is kind of a weak argumentation, and if they would have been a bit smarter about that, the whole Ukraine conflict would have not been necessary. But in this case, obviously, there is some validity to the invasion of Ukraine from the perspective of saying that NATO is moving and pushing towards the east, obviously. And then on the other side, proponents of the enlargement say, well, we need to bolster ourselves against the Russians. This argumentation is equally false, because the security organization is a defensive pact. But if your argumentation is that enlargement is used as a deterrence or kind of a terrorizing method against another power bloc, such as Russia, or let's say in other cases, China or any other country. So you have a defensive pact and you utilize it to go against another powerful actor, then it's not a defensive organization anymore. Then it becomes offensive. And once that happens, you cannot really blame someone to wage wars and also try to expand by violent means. But if the argumentation would have been, we as NATO want to enlarge because we know that securitization also helps us to develop economically and from a societal perspective, then that's totally fine. I mean, there is there's also much validity in Finland and Sweden joining NATO, because those two countries are culturally very similar to the bulk of NATO countries of Europe, basically. And because that is the case, it only makes, culturally sense that they are part of NATO in order to support themselves. I mean, similar countries helping out, each other out is a good thing. And if you have kind of the knowledge as a country that you are backed or kind of supported, that you are not going to be attacked, or if you are attacked, that they are going to support you, your allies, then obviously the economy and the society can flourish, because you don't have those security considerations that kind of bug you all the time. For example, in Turkey is part of NATO. We do not have to fear kind of another country invading us. The reason why we are economically and societally behind the other countries is that non-state actors are basically violently attacking Turkey. Terrorist organizations and also other criminal organized crime at the borders. There are rogue states that kind of indirectly harm the border regions of Turkey, and this is actually not covered in NATO. So there it does not work, but we do not have to fear that, for example, let's say Armenia or Syria is going to attack us, because we can rely on the support of our allies. But as I said, Finland and Sweden as well, and all the other European countries being part of NATO, in my opinion, is totally fine, but the argumentation cannot be that we are basically using this enlargement to kind of defend ourselves against Russia, but rather to build up the securitization in order for our economies to flourish, to have the security and, one kind of worry less on our plate. That's valid. The other one is invalid, because in the end that would make you an offensive organization, provoking other countries, and then in the end, leading to conflict. So there is much controversy about it, and I think it is in the interest of NATO. Obviously, this organization needs to kind of further their own interests, and that's perfectly fine. And I also understand that this goes against the interest of other countries such as Russia, but they have to further their interests in turn. So that would be the way for Russia to go, and not to complain that NATO is expanding eastward. Now, certainly this begs the questions, where do we go from now? It is very, it's a very sensitive situation, to be honest. I mean, we're talking about international state constructs, but in the end, nuances basically decide about conflict and then peace, basically. But what needs to be understood is that obviously, if NATO continues to provoke, they're going to get a response. The Western countries cannot simply act as if there's a power vacuum existing in the world, which is definitely not. And obviously they can enlarge, they can also pull Ukraine into this, they can expand and enlarge as much as they want, but they also need to think about the consequences. They also need to kind of shape their actions with a certain goodwill in order to reduce those consequences, which NATO is basically not doing. And the consequence of that should be that Russia is looking elsewhere for allies which are much stronger than most NATO members. For example, Russia, China, India. Those three countries, if they start to cooperate more closely, then NATO has to think twice about, yet another provocation. And what I think is going to happen, or is more and more coming to the foreground is that there's a major power shift. As you know, I'm a big fan, and I'm 100% favoring a multipolar international state order, meaning that we have regional power hubs that kind of have related countries in their influential zone, and those regional powers balance each other out. So we have kind of a dynamic balance between those regional superpowers. But we are basically not moving to this, but rather back to the bilateral international state order when we think about Russia and China cooperating more closely. The difference is that this time China and also India, but also the East Asian economies are much stronger than in the last century. So we might see an altered version of multipolarity in the world, which is not as multipolar as the ideal state would be, but we are moving kind of towards it. Meaning that this also will cause some sort of economic disconnect, as we are seeing right now. The West has basically turned its back on Russia and its resources, but also business and finance has moved away from Russia, and these sectors need to kind of reorient themselves in other areas of the world. So first places that Russia is going to look to is the Middle East, and where Russia had great relations actually with Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, but also to China. So power and money is shifting. And the problem with the Russian geography is, however, that the political center and the societal centers of Russia are on the western side of the country. So this is why NATO enlargement is still going to be an issue for Russia, because it's very accessible to Western powers if they continue to be offensive towards Russia, and even a reorientation of Russian political and economic power towards other regions of the world is not going to be sufficient to kind of to say, okay, well, we build our own world somewhere else because it is so close to the West. But this is a necessary shift. What else can Russia do? I mean, the geography is quite clear, and the countries at Russia's border are also pretty much antagonistic towards Russia, except for Belarus. So Russia has no choice but to look elsewhere and build their security and defense capacities elsewhere in the world. Is that going to be is that going to ease the situation? I don't know. It might build up the tension more and more, but it is also dependent on how the West reacts. I think the most logical response by the West, or NATO in this case, would be: you've provoked Russia enough. Russia needs to turn its back on the West. It needs to look elsewhere and build the capacities elsewhere. You've practically reached the point as NATO that Russia knows, okay, well, this is the point where we cannot go further west, and this is the end of the road, basically. And NATO needs to understand that, and also needs to make a cut and say, okay, well, this is the end of the road for us as well. Because at some point, if you provoke them even more, and you're seeing that Russia's response is on the other side not sufficient for their survival or their societal development to continue in a meaningful way, you basically leave them no other option but to attack you. And then obviously you can frame them as the bad guys, etc., etc. Fine, but it does not change the reality that too much of this power politics is going to harm you in the long run. at some point it's just like eating. At some point you're full. No matter how good it tastes, you need to stop eating, otherwise it's going to harm you. And because of that, it is going to be very interesting how fast Russia can readapt, and how they are going to respond, and how fast they're going to build up capacities elsewhere. And last question, or last development that is very important here, is what is going to happen to Ukraine. I think even if there is actually no long-term solution to it. Either Russia takes Ukraine, and that's the status quo, or the West is going to integrate Ukraine into NATO. And I think such things, or compromises as demilitarized zones and no flying zone. You cannot demilitarize a country. That's not possible. Otherwise, it's not a country anymore. It's like a whole big buffer zone, and this is not going to work. This is also not right. I mean, people living there. So it's going to be an either-or situation, and because Russia knows that, obviously, Russia will look to capture Ukraine. This might lead another wave, or lead to another wave of conflicts, and so on and so forth. But Ukraine matter is very important. Even if we have a neutralized situation, a compromise about Ukraine, in the long run, this conflict is going to flame up again. So this is also a very fragile situation. There is a lot of speculation about what's going to happen. We will see. As I said, I think both sides are kind of wrong, and we need to adapt a different lens to it, be a bit more realistic about it. And I think peaceful solution, it's a bit late for that, unfortunately. But nonetheless, I hope you liked the discussion. Let me know what you think. Comment down below, or write me an email. I would be very happy to receive your input, your opinions. And until next time for another podcast episode of SC the Magazine. So, take care, have a good one, and bye.